Hello, everybody, and welcome back. In our lecture today, we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement for Hispanic Americans. Mexican American population specifically has a nickname that some have used historically in social studies classes called Chicano. So sometimes this is also called the Chicano Movement. Make sure to get out your journals and in a new page, write down the heading, and don't forget to write down the essential question. How are the Chicano, the Mexican American, and African American civil rights movements similar, and how are they different? We're comparing and contrasting. You see on this picture in the background, by the way, a Chicano mural. The Chicano mural movement is one of the things we're going to be talking about in this lesson, and you'll see many of these depicted on the sides of buildings, restaurants, businesses, in the Southwest, in states such as our own home state of Texas, and in California. You'll see a lot of these, like in Los Angeles and San Diego. And in this mural specifically, you see a lot of civil rights activists and leaders, such as President John F. Kennedy, Mahatma Gandhi from India, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Maria Teresa, Mother Teresa, and many others. And then over here you see Cesar Chavez. So it shows a lot of like the civil rights leaders, and you see people marching and si se puede, yes we can, which is the big motto for the Chicano movement, and specifically for a group we're going to be talking about today with Cesar Chavez called the United Farm Workers. So here we go, let's begin. The history of Mexican-American relations in our country really goes back to the 1840s, because that's when the Mexican-American War took place. And America beat Mexico, and as a result, gained about 55% of the Mexican territory, which it incorporated into the United States. This is the entire Southwest, states of California, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, and of course, the whole war began because the United States had annexed Texas, the Republic of Texas, in 1846. And so with the whole Southwest becoming part of the United States, America also gained thousands of Mexican citizens, which now became American citizens. And although on the census they were counted as white citizens because there was not a separate reporting category for Hispanic peoples, they still encountered enormous discrimination, racism, and segregation, just as many African Americans would after the Civil War when slavery had ended. And so this is talking about in the southwestern part of the United States. And although there won't be as many instances of like lynchings or racially motivated murders as there will be for like Black Americans, there will be some terrible instances of racial violence against Hispanic peoples in the United States. I think previously we talked about the instance of Jesse Washington, who in Waco, Texas in 1915 was brutally murdered. He was a 15-year-old African-American farmhand who was accused of killing a farmer's wife in Robinson, and he was lynched after a very quick, very informal trial, not a very fair trial. They didn't really look at the evidence. Right here at our courthouse in Waco, Texas, and parts of his body were dragged through the streets of Waco there in 1915. And postcards were even made. It was one of the most awful, terrible lynchings in America, right here in our hometown. Well, in Thorndale, Texas, in 1911, 4 years before that, there was a 14-year-old Hispanic boy who was actually murdered in a very similar way. He was lynched after a very quick trial. No evidence was really taken into account. And a mob of angry white, racists, they basically take him out of the jail and they lynch him. And then they drag his body parts through the streets there in Thorndale. That's just south of Waco here. And so there was violence against Hispanic people. There was also in the Southwest, in California and Texas and whatnot, there were many businesses that would deny employment opportunities or services to Hispanic people, had windows that said, "We don't serve your kind," and things like that. And there was also in Texas and California and other parts of the Southwest, there were many schools that segregated Hispanic populations, that didn't allow Hispanic children to go to school with the white students. They would have separate Hispanic schools separate African American schools, and in California, even separate Asian schools for different populations. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And it's not the same as for African Americans, because in the southern part of the United States, remember, segregation was based on law. If you were African American, those were the Jim Crow laws. For Hispanic students and the Hispanic population, this is more the cultural custom segregation. So it could vary in how severe it was, community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood, even city by city, county by county. But we're primarily talking again about the southwestern part of the country, states from California to Texas, okay? Now, the situation is going to become more dire during the 1930s because of the Great Depression, okay? In the 1930s, when you have jobs being extremely scarce, and about a quarter of the United States population without a job, living homeless. This is where you had homeless communities develop on the edges or in the parks and cities called the Hoovervilles. So this was the Great Depression. Because jobs were so scarce, there will be increased racism and marginalization against Hispanic peoples. They were seen as taking jobs away from white folk. And so in California, in Texas, in parts of the Southwest, there began this campaign of Mexican repatriation. It wasn't officially a law or anything that was passed, so we don't have like official numbers from the INS or anything, but it's estimated that roughly 2 million people of Hispanic descent were deported forcefully from the United States. Others volunteered to leave because they didn't want to face the ridicule and discrimination of being rounded up in raids and dropped off at the southern border. Many others were raided up. There's famous areas in like Los Angeles where authorities knew that there were large populations of Hispanic people, and they got trucks in those areas and they just picked them up. They raided. They didn't allow these people to say goodbye to their neighbors. They didn't allow them to take their possessions. They were just put in trucks, trains, cars, whatever it was. Sometimes the employers would take them to the border and just drop them off. There were Hispanic people in hospitals who were, in emergency type medical situations, who were taken out of the hospital, out of their beds there, and taken to the border regardless of their health. And then probably the worst part of all of this is that, legally speaking, about 60% of the 2 million Hispanic peoples that were deported forcefully from the United States during the Great Depression, make room for white jobs because of racism, about 60% of them were American citizens, okay? They were American citizens. Forget about their 14th Amendment. I mean, they're supposed to be treated equally. Hello, they were not. They were not being treated equally. They were being deported for nothing other than their race, and they had no legal recourse. The government didn't care about their citizenship status. The fact that they were American citizens, it didn't matter. They got deported. So that was Mexican repatriation during the 1930s. That finally ended in 1936 as we get into the lead up of World War II. And remember, during World War II, the situation is going to change drastically, as you had 16 million American men being drafted, being sent off to the war to go fight in Europe against the Nazis, to fight in the Pacific against the Japanese. You're going to have a shortage of laborers, of workers back home in the United States. And that's where, Rosie the Riveter, we can do it, with women taking up that slack. But you also have many minorities that took up the slack as well, to work in factories, to work on the railroads, to work in the farms, okay? And in the Southwest especially, there was a huge recruitment program to bring Mexican laborers, migrant field workers into the United States to pick up the labor shortage on farms. And this was known as the Bracero program, okay? And the Bracero program is going to continue from World War II into the 1960s, bringing over eventually millions of Mexican people, some of whom will find permanent residency in the United States, but it was meant to be a temporary worker visa program. Under the Bracero program, you had the government saying that it was going to enforce certain protections for these Mexicans that were brought over to the United States to work on our farms temporarily, that they were to be given adequate water and breaks and food and lodging by their employers, the owners of these farms that they would work on. That typically that did not happen. Typically they were not given those things, okay? And due to a lot of the abuses that many of the braceros, these field laborers will, be exploited, they'll be taken advantage of. Due to these exploitations, we will have the rise of like Cesar Chavez and his labor movement. That's where that comes from. So more on that in a second. Now, LULAC is the League of United Latin American Citizens. It was formed in the 1920s and was the oldest Hispanic civil rights organization. So when you think LULAC, kind of think of the Hispanic version of like the NAACP. It's not always going to be as effective because part of the problem that LULAC and the whole Hispanic or Chicano civil rights movement has when fighting for equality is that Hispanic Americans are a very broad mix of people. It's not like African Americans who have a very common background and ancestry. Hispanic Americans could be Mexican American, they could be Puerto Rican American, Puerto Ricans are Americans, they could be straight from Spain, they could be from Colombia or Nicaragua, they could be from Honduras or Panama or from Belize or Bolivia or Argentina or Brazil or Caribbean. The only thing that unites Hispanic people is kind of a common ancient like Spanish ancestry in the Spanish language. And so as such a broad group, that's where legally there was a lot of confusion. Just like when, America originally gained all this Mexican territory, how did they classify these citizens? There's a lot of ambiguity. That means like uncertainties. And so that's kind of hampered the civil rights movement for Hispanics since the 1940s, because after World War II, we're going to see the beginning of desegregation for Hispanic school children, often assisted by organizations such as LULAC, but it's going to run into some bumps in the road. Now, Hector Garcia, pictured here next to John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy there in the 60s. Hector Garcia was a Hispanic veteran of World War II. He served for the United States. And coming home after the war, he sees that a lot of his fellow Hispanic veterans that had fought for the United States were being discriminated against. After serving, fighting, and many of them dying for a country that wasn't willing to protect their freedoms that they, sacrificed for, he forms the American GI Forum, which was specifically a Hispanic civil rights group to fight for Hispanic veterans. And one of the things that they're going to do specifically was to help many Hispanic veterans who had died receive their burial rights in their hometowns. There was one such case where in this small town in Texas, a family had lost their son. He died in World War II, and the town refused to allow the son to be buried in the communal cemetery because it was segregated. It was only for white deceased people. Cemeteries were segregated. And so the American GI Forum got heavily involved and got legal action against this, and eventually got the United States Senator to intervene and to change these policies. That United States Senator, by the way, was future US President Lyndon Baines Johnson. All right. So Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta was born in New Mexico. Her mother was the owner of a hotel, and she grew up with seeing and meeting a lot of different peoples. Many Hispanic migrant laborers would stay there in the different rooms, and she got to know their life. And later on, she became, going through segregated school and working really hard to get into college and everything against all the odds and racial discrimination at the time. She becomes a public school teacher and teaching primarily Hispanic kids. She wasn't able to teach the lessons that are required because oftentimes these kids would come to class starving to death. They would come to class without, having been able to get a change of clothes for every day of the week because they didn't own that many clothes. They didn't have the school supplies. And, it broke her heart day in and day out being a teacher for these students that had so few resources that they weren't able to concentrate on their schooling. So she decided to quit her job as a teacher and instead become an activist to try to fix the problem at its cause, which was the oppression that many Hispanic families were facing that led to a lack of opportunities, that led to them not being able to partake in this American dream of ours. And so she's a big activist for not only Hispanic rights, Mexican American civil rights, workers' rights, farm workers' rights, but also women's rights as well. And she's still alive today. She's 90 years old. I'm filming this in 2021. A few years ago, when Barack Obama was president, she actually received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It's the highest honor that a civilian can receive. So there you go, in 2012. Now, for Dolores Huerta specifically, you need to know, like for the STAR test, you need to know about her role as one of the co-founders of the United Farm Workers. That's the big labor organization with Cesar Chavez. Dolores Huerta was right there helping to found it in the 1960s. And this is the labor union. Remember, a union is where workers come together to fight for workers' rights, better pay, better conditions, better hours. For the primarily Hispanic field workers in these farms growing tomatoes, growing grapes, growing whatever the crop was, they were severely taken advantage of. Remember the promises that they were supposed to be given: food, lodging, fair treatment, breaks, water, all those things, like from the Bracero program, that never really manifested, that never really came through. And so that's what this organization is going to be about. And the other co-founder of it, you probably are familiar with, is this guy right here named Cesar Chavez. So let's see if I put my face somewhere where it doesn't get in the way. Not always the story. Don't want to be in the way. Okay, so there's Dolores Huerta. Huelga means strike, like refuse to work, protest, okay, strike. And by the way, Dolores Huerta, she's the one that actually had come up with the slogan that's going to be so important for the movement of Hispanic field laborers, for Mexican-American civil rights, for the Hispanic civil rights movement in general, and for civil rights in general, called Si Se Puede, which, yes, we can. She's the one who came up with that slogan. Okay, so Cesar Chavez. Whew. Big topic, right? So Cesar Chavez is super famous. We have like our middle school here in Waco named after him. In fact, there's a lot of schools and places all around the southwestern part of the United States, from Texas to California again, that are named after Cesar Chavez because he's an icon of the Hispanic civil rights movement. But let's talk about who he actually was and what he did. So he was born in Yuma, Arizona in the 1920s. And in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, his family lost their farm and business there in Arizona, and they moved to California like so many others during the Great Depression. Remember, like the Okies, because of the Dust Bowl and everything. And so in California, this is where he has to quit school in the 8th grade in order to support his family. Many Hispanic kids were forced to quit school early just to make ends meet and help out their family. And so he knows very personally what the lifestyle was and the challenges that many Hispanic families faced there in California. And in the late 1950s, he becomes a leader of a labor rights group that was trying to secure better labor conditions for Hispanic workers and generally, you know, field workers on these farms, because they were being taken advantage of by the big, you know, corporate farm owners. Okay, they were getting, there was no such thing as minimum wage for a field laborer. They were not getting adequate pay, not even close. They're working long, long hours under the hot sun. Okay, this is the southwestern part of the United States. It is very, very hot. It's part of the Sun Belt, remember? And they're not being given breaks. They're not being given, you know, water. They have to bring their own. They're very limited on being able to not suffer heat exhaustion. And they're working super long hours. So, I mean, it's really unsafe conditions with very minimal pay, and they're being taken advantage of. And so that's where he gets into this. And he's going to borrow a lot of the tactics from the African-American civil rights movement, meaning he's going to borrow nonviolent tactics. These were tactics he was directly inspired from, like by the Indian civil rights leader from the 1920s and 30s in India named Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, Gandhi had helped to also inspire Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, nonviolent tactics that you use, marches, demonstrations, sit-ins, those sorts of things, that you get a media presence and media attention. You get cameras, you get television. So you you generate support basically for your cause, and it's a grassroots movement, you know, of the people, that, you know, one person can't do this alone. You need to get lots and lots of people on your side. That's why the media plays such an important part. And so using these nonviolent tactics, and Cesar Chavez was very devout to the nonviolent cause. He is going to get a huge following, and actually later in the 60s, along with Dolores Huerta, founds this United Farm Workers Organization. There's their symbol right there. AFL-CIO, again, it's a labor union, okay? And they will combine the efforts of many Mexican-American, Filipino-American, many of these field laborers of all different backgrounds. They're going to combine their efforts to do some massive protest. Probably the most famous was the protest that began in 1965 of the Delano Grape Company, table grapes. They were infamous for mistreating their field workers, the farm workers. And so the slogan was, don't buy the grapes, okay? Not if they're made by a company that doesn't support the union or support the workers, in other words. And so for 5 years, they organized this protest, this boycott. Remember, a boycott is like from Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott we talked about from 1955. That's where you refuse to buy something to hurt that business or that entity that is doing a practice that is racist or segregationist or harmful. You boycott them in order to hurt them economically, hurt them where it counts, with their money. And so for 5 years in California, they refused to buy the grapes, and they get many civilians, they get you know, thousands of people not to buy these grapes. And finally, the company by 1970 was forced to relent. They also combine these boycotting efforts with pickets. A picket is where they get all the workers to refuse to show up to work, kind of like a strike. Again, huelga, strike. So they refused to show up to work. They refused to buy the grapes. Eventually, the company was forced to change its practices to offer better pay, better you know, conditions, better breaks, you know, fewer hours, all those things. And they're going to do this with red lettuce. They're going to do this with many other products as well from other corporate, you know, farm conglomerates that were taking advantage of the workers. Cesar Chavez and the UFW, they will continue to do these nonviolent tactics to change workers' lives for the better. That's what Cesar Chavez is famous for. And like I said, in fighting for farm workers' rights, he becomes an icon for the Hispanic civil rights movement, a movement that you can see in the murals done throughout the Southwest. They show, these are big paintings, again, on the sides of buildings. You see them outside in Austin and Houston. You see them in El Paso. You see them in Phoenix. You see them in Los Angeles and San Diego. But these murals, they depict not only the civil rights movement for Hispanic people in the United States and for other groups that were fighting for civil rights or equality, but you also see images of Hispanic culture, okay? Hispanic culture, remember, culture is the way we live, so it includes your religion, includes your food, it includes your history. And so in this one here, there's the eagle's representative, the eagle holding the snake in its claws. That's representative of like the Aztecs and how they founded their capital city, Tenochtitlan, there where Mexico City is today. That's Mexico, right? That's part of their history. You can see also here the depiction of the Virgin Mother, right? This is Mother Mary. That's a big symbol in Catholicism. And so it has these depictions of Hispanic culture. Here is another one as well. You see like various civil rights leaders like MLK, Cesar Chavez, Harriet Tubman, who led the Underground Railroad, bringing African-American slaves up to freedom in the North. Nelson Mandela, who fought for freedom and the end of apartheid or segregation in South Africa. And you see like all these depictions of Hispanic culture and civil rights in this mural. And this one here, again, like the Aztec, the warrior eagle symbol. Okay. You see like a family, an immigrant family, they're coming for opportunities. It's like the future with technology and stuff. And here's like various civil rights leaders again, MLK and JFK. So that's the Chicano mural movement depicting elements of Hispanic culture. And again, taking pride in your culture and like where you come from and who you are, taking pride in that, that it's not something to be ashamed of, but something to celebrate. Because America is a place of many different groups. And like we've had from World War II, this emphasis on a pluralistic society, a society where we should be made up of everybody and welcoming to everyone. All right, this next part of this lecture, we are going to be getting into some of the very important court cases. And I know that this video is already getting a little long, so I'm going to go through these very briefly. But basically, Mendez versus Westminster in 1947, here's Sylvia Mendez. This was a case where you have Hispanic school children segregated in California. Sylvia Mendez's parents, they sue the Westminster School District over her having to attend the segregated Hispanic school that was very inferior, very poor compared to the nice white elementary school that was near her. And they win their case, proving that, you know, Hispanic school children deserve to be treated equally, just like any children. This was in 1947. And by winning this case, it's going to be a big breakthrough for desegregating schools. Chief Justice Earl Warren, in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, that's going to desegregate all kids in 1954. In the next decade, he was the governor of California when this happened. Thurgood Marshall was also involved in the case, as was LULAC and the American GI Forum. Remember, Thurgood Marshall was the African-American attorney for the NAACP that will be instrumental in that Brown versus Board decision. And so Hispanic school children can now attend white schools in California by 1947. Same thing in Texas. In 1948, LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and the American GI Forum, they're going to get lawyered up and they're going to fight Hispanic school segregation in Texas. And they will win this case of Delgado versus Bastrop ISD. Bastrop ISD is near Austin, well, in the Hill Country. And again, there's like this was in 1948. You might put that in your notes. Delgado versus Bastrop, Hispanic segregation for children in schools was ended in 1948 with this case. But here's a picture from the 1920s of Hispanic segregated classroom whose teacher was this young, recently graduated white man named Lyndon Baines Johnson. He taught at this all Hispanic segregated school in Cotulla, Texas. That was in the 1920s. And so Bastrop, that case, 1948. Hernandez v. Texas from 1954. This case is going to be about murder, okay, and about the juries that get to judge you in criminal cases and in all sorts of court cases. Because basically, Pete Hernandez, pictured right here, Pete Hernandez was accused of murdering someone else, and he goes to trial. And he's immediately found guilty by an all-white jury. That means all the people that were judging him were white. And so his attorneys, a very famous Hispanic lawyer named Gustavo Garcia, right there, going to be the first Hispanic lawyer ever to appear before the Supreme Court, are going to appeal his case that his 14th Amendment was being violated because he was not being treated equally under the law, being judged by people who were not like him. You're supposed to be judged by a jury of your peers. Peers are people who are like you. And so this all-white jury wasn't cutting it. They get appealed, and then the Supreme Court rules for the first time ever being, hearing a case specifically on Hispanic civil rights, first time ever being argued by a Hispanic lawyer. The Supreme Court says, yeah, this wasn't fair, okay? It wasn't right. It violates the 14th Amendment. That basically, it says for the first time also that there are other groups that are affected by the lack of opportunities in America besides African Americans. There are other groups in America that have been marginalized, that have been discriminated against, that have not been treated fairly and have not been given equal status or the opportunities that white men have typically been given. So this is the first time that the court acknowledges this. And in their final ruling, the Supreme Court says in Hernandez v. Texas that Pete Hernandez deserved a retrial, to be retried by a jury of his peers, people who were from his neighborhood, who represented and knew more about his circumstances, people who looked more like him. Not to say that he should be judged by like all Hispanics, but that the jury should be mixed and it should be fair. Okay, so that was the ruling in Hernandez v. Texas. In Miranda versus Arizona, this is from the 1960s. Ernesto Miranda was arrested for the kidnap, rape, and murder of a young woman. So this is a pretty serious offense. But when he was arrested, the police kind of strong-armed him. They put him in one of those interrogation rooms, and they immediately forced him to sign a confession that he did all of this without him knowing what he was signing. See, you're supposed to be informed of your rights if you weren't aware. You're supposed to be told these things like you have the Fifth Amendment right to remain silent so that you won't say anything that might make you appear guilty in the court of law. You're supposed to be able to have somebody represent and defend you if you can't defend yourself. You're supposed to have these things, and he didn't know. And so in his case that goes up to the Supreme Court's actually going to rule for, again, a retrial for Ernesto Miranda. And this is the case that will establish the very famous Miranda rights. So you have to be read your Miranda rights upon being arrested. Otherwise, the trial could be thrown out. The Miranda rights are, you have the right to remain silent because anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to a lawyer. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you. And then, do you understand these rights? And so policemen have to inform you. They have to tell you of those rights before you can actually be arrested. It has to be done while you're being arrested, or the case can be completely thrown out. And by the way, the right to remain silent, that comes from the Fifth Amendment, no self-incrimination. When you're standing before a court, as a witness or on the witness stand, you don't have to say anything that could make you appear guilty, okay? In the case of Gideon versus Wainwright, a little bit later, that's going to be where they're going to insist that if you can't afford an attorney, a lawyer to defend you, one will be provided for you, a public defender. Okay, and then finally, the last thing you need to know is going to be the American Indian Movement, or AIM as it's called. It was formed in 1968 in Minneapolis, and the American Indian Movement was a result of many Native Americans kind of being forced through lack of opportunities on their reservations into America's cities, living very impoverished. They were called the urban Indians, and that will kind of be the impetus behind the beginning of their civil rights movement. But the things that AIM's going to be famous for will actually be fighting for tribal rights and an end to Native American cultural discrimination. Okay, think about like sports teams, like the Redskins and stuff. This is a very terrible example of how America treats and views Native Americans, that doesn't, hold us responsible to our really rough history, where our country, our government systematically basically slaughtered many of these people to push them off their land, to take it for white people. During settlement, during the Homestead Act, during the Indian Wars. One of the most famous demonstrations that AIM participated in was the occupation of Alcatraz Island in the 1970s. And they also did the Trail of Broken Treaties. That was a big march that led to Washington, D.C. AIM is still around today, and the big thing they're working for is, again, securing more rights for Native Americans, for different sorts of tribes, and for their rights on reservations, and to end cultural appropriation and other cultural discrimination against Native Americans. All right, now, I know that was a lot. I feel like I'm out of breath, but hopefully you learned some good stuff about the Chicano civil rights movement and about some of these key Supreme Court cases. Don't forget to write your summary, and I will talk to you guys later. Thank you.